Tuesday evening, 1975. You need to make a phone call. Simple enough, you'd think. Except you don't have a phone in the house. So you pull on your coat, grab whatever coins are rattling around in the kitchen drawer, and you step out into the cold. And somewhere down the street, probably next to the post office or outside the off-license, stands a red telephone box, lit up faintly in the dark, smelling of cigarettes and something else you never quite identified. And you squeeze inside, pick up that heavy black receiver, and the whole ritual begins. You either remember this or you don't, and if you do, this video is going to take you right back. Because making a phone call in 1975, Britain was not a simple act. It was an event. It had rules. It had obstacles. It had its own particular kind of stress that nobody born after 1990 will ever truly understand. And yet, and this is the strange part, we miss it. Not the frustration, not the queuing in the rain, but something about it, something we can't quite name. So let's talk about it properly. Let's go back. Because this story is about more than phones. It's about the way we lived, the way we connected, the way Britain actually worked before everything became instant and easy and somehow a little bit emptier. Let's start with the box itself. The red telephone box, designed by Sir Giles Gilbert Scott back in 1935 and still standing proud on British streets 40 years later. You knew exactly where yours was. Every neighbourhood had its box the way every neighbourhood had its pub and its corner shop. It was a landmark, a fixture, and it had a personality, a very specific smell that hit you the moment you pulled that heavy door open. Damp, stale smoke, a faint trace of somebody's chips from earlier. The floor was always slightly sticky. There were usually a few dead leaves in the corner. Sometimes there was a phone directory hanging on a chain, and sometimes there wasn't. And either way, it had been handled by approximately 10,000 people, and felt like it. The receiver was heavy, properly heavy. Black bakelite, solid as a rock, worn smooth where a million hands had gripped it before yours. You pressed it to your ear and heard that particular tone, that specific British dialing tone. A low, continuous purring sound that meant the line was live and waiting. That sound, if you heard it right now, your stomach would do something. It would recognize it before your brain did. But here's the part that caused immediate panic. You needed the right coins. Specifically, you needed a 2p piece or a 10p piece, depending on which type of box you were standing in. Because not all boxes took the same coins, and not all boxes worked. You'd pick up the receiver, insert your coin, and sometimes nothing happened. Dead. Silent. Somebody had jammed it. Somebody had stolen the mechanism. Or it simply hadn't worked since 1973 and nobody from the GPO had been out to fix it yet. The GPO, the General Post Office. They ran the entire telephone network in Britain until 1980. Every phone box, every line, every operator. A government monopoly so enormous and so slow that getting a telephone line installed in your home could take months. We'll come back to that, because that story is something else entirely. Now, if you were one of the households that actually had a telephone at home, you were doing all right. In 1975, only around 35% of British homes had a telephone, less than 1 in 3. Think about that for a moment. 2/3 of the country were walking to the box in the rain to make their calls. And even if you had a phone at home, it came with its own particular set of complications that modern people would find absolutely extraordinary. The phone was not yours. Not really. The GPO owned it. You rented it from them. Renting a basic telephone handset cost around £2 a year. In today's money, that's roughly £22 annually. Just to have the privilege of keeping their equipment in your hallway. You couldn't modify it. You couldn't replace the handset. You certainly couldn't go out and buy a new phone from a shop because phones weren't sold in shops. They were issued by the GPO in the color they decided you could have, which was usually black, sometimes ivory if you were considered suitable. And then there was the party line. Oh, the party line. This is the one that younger people simply cannot believe is true. In 1975, particularly in rural areas, many households shared a telephone line with their neighbours. Not the same bill, not the same account, the same physical line. You would pick up your receiver to make a call, and quite often you would hear your neighbour already on the line, mid-conversation, completely unaware you were there. The etiquette around this was entirely unspoken and entirely British. You were supposed to quietly replace the receiver and try again later. What actually happened varied considerably depending on how well you got on with next door. Some people listened. We all know it. Nobody admitted it. This was essentially a surveillance system installed in every home and maintained at public expense, and Britain treated it with the same cheerful denial it applies to everything mildly embarrassing. Here is the part that nobody talks about when they talk about phones in 1975. The operator. If you wanted to make a long-distance call, particularly to another part of the country, you often couldn't just dial directly. You had to go through the operator. You picked up the phone, waited for the tone, and dialed 100. And a real human being answered. Usually a woman. Always with a very specific telephone voice that existed nowhere else in British life. Crisp, efficient, slightly clipped. Which service do you require? You told her you wanted to be connected to a number in, say, Glasgow. She would then manually connect your call through an exchange. You would hear clicking, crackling, a series of distant tones, and then, if it worked, a ringing sound at the other end that sounded like it was coming from underwater. Long-distance calls sounded as though the other person was calling from the bottom of the sea, and they were expensive. A 3-minute call from London to Glasgow in 1975 cost around 40 pence at peak rate. That is roughly £4.50 in today's money, for 3 minutes. People time their calls, literally watch the clock. You said what you needed to say, and you said it fast. You did not chat. You did not catch up. You delivered information, and you got off the line. This is why people wrote letters. Not because they were romantic or slow or old-fashioned, because letters were cheaper. Now, let's talk about getting a phone installed in the first place, because this is where the story takes a turn. You moved into a new house in 1975. No telephone line. You contact the GPO to arrange installation. They take your details. They tell you there is a waiting list. How long is the waiting list? That depends. On where you live, on how busy the local exchange is, on whether the GPO has the right equipment available. It could be 6 weeks, it could be 6 months. In some parts of Britain, in some years during the 1970s, people waited over a year for a telephone to be installed. A year, waiting for a telephone, while living in a house with no way to make calls except walking to the box in all weathers. And when the engineers did eventually arrive, you had very little say in the matter. The phone went where the GPO decided it went, which was almost always in the hallway, not the kitchen, not the sitting room. The hallway, cold, usually drafty. No chair, you stood to make your calls, hunched slightly, one hand pressing the receiver against your ear and the other pressed flat against the wall for warmth. Britain had cold hallways and shorter phone calls, and those two things were absolutely connected. If you weren't there, nobody alive can truly explain this to you. The specific psychological weight of a telephone ringing in a 1975 British house. The way the whole family stopped. The way someone would shout, "I'll get it," and run. The way you answered not with hello, but with your telephone number, read out carefully. Because that is what you did. That is what was correct. Chiswick 4, 723. Spoken with a formality that belonged to a different era even then. Because a ringing phone in 1975 meant something. It meant someone had made a deliberate effort, found your number, dialed it carefully, got the right exchange, paid for the call. A phone call was a committed act. It meant something was important. We didn't know we were losing that. When the changes came slowly through the 80s, when British Telecom replaced the GPO in 1980, when phone shops appeared on the high street, when the red boxes started disappearing, when the waiting lists vanished and the prices dropped and everyone slowly got their own line in their own sitting room, we thought it was pure improvement. And in most ways, it was. Of course it was. Nobody genuinely wants to queue in a cold phone box in November. But something went with it. The weight of the call. The cost of it. The deliberateness. When every call became cheap and easy and instant, the calls themselves meant slightly less. You rang people for nothing. For a chat. For something you'd already half forgotten by the time they answered. And that was lovely. But it was different. The corporations didn't consult us, the government broke up the GPO and handed it to the market, and the market made everything faster and cheaper and more convenient. And nobody asked whether we wanted to keep the bit where a phone call meant something. Nobody asked us if that was all right. We were a nation of people who wrote letters on a Sunday afternoon, who saved up their news for the weekly call to mum, who knew their neighbours' voices before they knew their faces, heard through a shared party line on a Wednesday morning, who measured love in the length of a call and the cost of it and the fact that someone had stood in a freezing hallway just to hear your voice. We were that country, and we didn't say goodbye to it properly. The last red telephone boxes still stand here and there, painted, preserved. Some of them sell books now or house defibrillators, and people photograph them as landmarks, as symbols of something British and old and worth keeping. They photograph them without knowing quite why they feel something when they see one. But you know why, don't you? Right then. If this brought back something you hadn't thought about in years, drop it in the comments. Tell us where your local phone box was. Tell us if you were on a party line. Tell us the number you used to dial from memory without even thinking, and whether some part of you still remembers it now. We read every single one. Subscribe if you want more of this. And if someone in your life would remember all of this, send it to them. They'll thank you for it.